Listen, my mom works in an office, so everything you're about to hear is very close to my heart. This isn't just content for the sake of use. It's a story based on real experiences. The goal is simple, to help you learn from yourself and not repeat other people's mistakes. All names, companies, and details in the story are fictional and have been changed.
The moment I knew they were circling was when my badge stopped working at the garage. It was a Wednesday, humid, no breeze, one of those mornings that makes your coffee taste like regret. I tapped the scanner once, red light. Again, red. The security guy, a kid who looked like he still called his mom to schedule dentist appointments, cleared his throat and said, might be a glitch? Right. And my 3-decade compliance archive just migrated itself to the shredder last week for fun. I smiled, got back in my car, and drove around to the visitor entrance like a damn stranger at a company where I'd redlined every major acquisition since 2004. It's always subtle at first. A calendar invite that gets rescinded. A quick sync that suddenly includes HR, or in my case, a hallway conversation that hushes the second you walk by. That was the week Madeline Voss started using phrases like institutional shedding and accelerated legacy transitions. Cute way of saying, we're gutting the old guard and spinning it like it's innovation. For 22 years, I was the person they called at 11:48 p.m. to fix the wording before a merger, calm a board member mid-divorce, or write the indemnity clause no one else could thread without tanking valuation. I didn't throw tantrums or run off to Burning Man. I carried 2 phones, 3 copies of every draft, and a red pen that scared the hell out of interns. I also wrote my own protocols for termination. For everyone, including myself. They forgot that part. Before I go further, if you're already hooked by this story, take a second to subscribe and hit that like button. It really helps more than you think, and it keeps this channel going so we can keep bringing you these stories that most people never tell out loud. We're just getting started. Anyway, the thing about being a legacy employee, their term not mine, is they assume you're either asleep at the wheel or too old to matter. Madeline never asked me a single question in our 3 briefings, not one. She showed up in her Apple Watch and sterile blazer, quoting case studies from Deloitte like she was reading bedtime stories to a bunch of interns, said I'd overbuilt the safety net. Funny, that net was the only reason her last 2 predecessors didn't end up sued into decorative paperweights. She axed Greg from procurement first, then Dana from internal audit. Both had been there longer than me. They were escorted out like they'd set the building on fire. 2 weeks later, HR scheduled me for a check-in. No agenda, just chat. I wore gray, neutral, forgettable, didn't bring my laptop. Just a notepad and a Mont Blanc I only use for things I plan to keep. In the room, Jenna from HR, Brad from legal, and an empty chair I assumed was meant for my dignity. Jenna smiled like she was pitching skincare at a wine mixer. We're giving you a choice today, she said sweetly. You can resign voluntarily, or we proceed with termination, effective immediately. I didn't flinch. I reached into my bag, pulled out a blank letterhead, and said, I'll write my own. Brad shifted. Jenna blinked. I could feel the confusion start to grow like mold in the silence. That's the thing about people who try to corner you. They're not ready when you stop playing defense and start documenting. They thought I'd panic. They thought I'd cry. They had no idea I'd already written this chapter 5 years ago. I just hadn't dated it yet. They had the nerve to slide the manila folder across the table like it was a dessert menu. Jenna from HR folded her hands on top of it like she was waiting for me to compliment the paper stock. Brad sat 2 seats down, posture perfect, pretending to be dispassionate. But his eyes kept twitching toward the corner of the file where my name, misspelled ironically, was typed in bold. Per company policy, you have the option to submit your resignation today, Jenna said, voice syrupy and slow, like I was too old to process language quickly. Or we move forward with formal termination. The choice is yours. There's something grotesquely polite about being offered a guillotine or poison. I smiled. A real one. No teeth, just calm calculation. I'll write my own, I said, reaching into my tote and pulling out my notebook. Jenna blinked. Brad adjusted his tie like it was suddenly too tight. I flipped to a fresh page. Ballpoint clicked. You don't need time to review the terms? Brad asked, like the mouse realizing too late that the cheese had been glued down. Not necessary, I replied. I drafted the original version of this policy back in '09. Page 7 still uses my phrasing. You kept the Oxford comma. I appreciated that. Silence. 6 weeks ago, my department had 15 people. Today, 7. And only because 3 of us were legally required to sign off on SEC disclosures. I'd watch the layoffs come down like hail, quiet meetings, calendar scrubs, LinkedIn updates disguised as personal pivots. I knew mine was coming. But they misunderstood something critical. They thought I'd be reactive. I've never reacted a day in my life. I prepare. Madeline called it operational renewal. I called it what it was. Purge theater with a consulting budget and bad lighting. She made her intentions clear in her first all hands. Lanik needs to feel leaner, sharper, less nostalgia, more now. Then she gutted 3 compliance controls that took me 8 years to bulletproof. What she didn't realize was that every system she streamlined still had my signature embedded somewhere, buried in the metadata, time-stamped, or reflected in contract language that hadn't been revised since I put it there. So when Jenna handed me that folder with the resignation script pre-written in HR East, I have decided to step away to explore new opportunities. I didn't flinch. I wrote 1 sentence, 1 clean, surgical line. Then I handed it to her and said, "This will do." She looked down, her brow pinched. "Effective upon full release as defined under Schedule C." Brad leaned in. "Schedule C? Should be in the compliance archive," I said casually. "It's referenced in the enterprise severance schema, tied to the legacy policy portfolio, Clause 14E, if I remember correctly." I remembered perfectly. I'd written it. The air in the room changed, not dramatically, not enough for panic, but just enough for confusion to take root. They thought they were handing me a quiet exit. What they didn't realize, what they never even thought to check, was that the moment they asked me to resign, they activated the most expensive sentence in the company's history. 12 words. That's all it took. On the surface, my resignation looked like any other. A single sentence typed in plain Calibri, black ink, double-spaced, polite to the point of being boring. But buried at the end, camouflaged like a rattlesnake under dry leaves, sat the clause they didn't even blink at. Effective upon full release as defined under Schedule C. I hit print twice, slid 1 copy across the table to Jenna, placed the other neatly in my leather folder. I signed both with the same pen I'd used to countersign 7-figure contracts, NDAs, and once, a last-minute clause during an acquisition that saved us from a $12 million exposure. Brad picked up the resignation like it might bite him. "You're not going to negotiate terms?" he asked, frowning. "No," I said gently. "This covers everything I need." He read it again, slower this time. The edges of his professional calm started to fray. His eyes flicked toward Jenna, who was already folding the paper like she couldn't wait to file it, and hit send on the offboarding email template. Schedule C, 3 syllables that meant nothing to them in that moment. But to me, it was the detonator. See? I'd authored Schedule C myself, years ago as part of a broader severance protections package during the Rallister merger. Most execs forgot it existed. Hell, most didn't even realize it was still nested inside the compliance archive because it wasn't labeled clearly. It was simply Addendum, Release and Vesting Protections, Legacy Roles. And even if they'd found it, they wouldn't have understood what it triggered. That's the thing about legacy architecture. Nobody reads what's older than the last CEO, but I did. I maintained it, quietly, updated it every year, wrapped it in procedural language so dry, legal left it alone. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said, standing slowly, tucking my folder under one arm. Jenna gave me a weird little smile, like she thought she'd just pulled off a humane firing. Brad half stood, looking like he wanted to say something clever, but thought better of it. I nodded at both of them, walked out. No drama, no raised voice, but as the door clicked shut behind me, I already knew the countdown had started. That sentence I handed them wasn't a resignation. It was a trigger. And within days, it would set off a chain reaction they weren't remotely prepared for. The email went out by 4:12 p.m. sharp. After 22 years of service, Meredith Vaughn has chosen to step away to explore new opportunities. I read it while sipping a glass of Barbera on my back porch, legs tucked under a throw blanket, my dog snoring against my ankle. Chose to step away, they wrote, like I'd just gotten bored of winning. My inbox access had already been revoked. Badge access, gone. Retirement calculator, frozen. The company Slack even put one of those little party hat emojis next to my name, like I was on my way to Margaritaville. They were fast. I'll give them that. But they weren't thorough. Because by 8:17 the next morning, payroll had flagged something. Severance had not processed. My benefits file showed status, pending. And my stock ledger, completely untouched. Normally, that happens automatically on the back end, thanks to a script I helped write during a system overhaul in 2018. But the script had a failsafe. It cross-checked against any active clauses tagged under legacy provisions. Schedule C was one of them, and it had just gone hot. Someone in legal finally bothered to read it. I picture it like this. An overworked associate, maybe 2 years out of law school, slumped in a cardigan with a Red Bull and a half-eaten Cliff Bar, dragging through the digital archive. They hit the file. Pause. Reread the trigger phrase 3 times. Then their face slowly drains as they realize that clause, voluntary resignation initiated by request, matched the exact conditions of the resignation I signed. The exact wording. They probably thought it was dead, outdated, irrelevant. A fossilized piece of compliance fluff buried in a dusty corner of our digital vault. Except it wasn't. See, I'd written Schedule C back in 2017 as part of a retention counterweight during an M&A freeze. At the time, senior counsel were being asked to shoulder impossible liabilities with zero protection. So I designed a clause that quietly rewarded stability, but only if someone was forced out under the pretense of a gracious exit. Most execs didn't care. They thought it was a backpat for retiring VPs. They never expected it to be used against them, and certainly not by the person who wrote it. The clause was airtight. It required full release of stock, retroactive severance at peak bonus year averages, healthcare extension through COBRA override, and indemnity from future audit review. But most importantly, it triggered automatically. No negotiation, no signature needed. The resignation itself, if requested, was enough. And I just handed them the exact combination that lit the fuse. Now they were scrambling. It was rerunning back-end entitlement scripts. Finance was emailing HR with urgent in all caps. My name was showing up in systems I hadn't touched in months. And somewhere in legal, a partner had just asked the CFO, did she really write effective upon full release as defined under Schedule C? I imagined the silence that followed. Because by then, they knew. They hadn't accepted my resignation. They'd activated a liability bomb. Clause 14E wasn't flashy. It didn't come with bold fonts or highlighter yellow. No memo had ever announced its existence. It sat buried in the lower third of a document titled Legacy Continuity Provisions Addendum C, inside a folder labeled Archived Pre-Merger Compliance, Internal Use Only, the sort of bureaucratic detritus executives assume is just legal ballast. Except this one wasn't. The clause, 4 paragraphs long, lawyer-dry, perfectly phrased, spelled out very clearly that any employee whose resignation was initiated at the request of the company would be granted full retroactive severance based on their 3 highest earning years, immediate vesting of all stock options, and sweeping indemnity protections across any operational division they had previously audited or advised. In my case, that meant 4 of them: operations, legal, vendor risk, acquisitions. Each one still had my initials stamped across key policy frameworks, tucked neatly into the audit trails. You couldn't unwind that influence if you tried. And now, they were legally required to treat me like a high-impact asset being transitioned, not discarded, which meant payout, protection, and a very quiet, very expensive cleanup operation. HR had skimmed the surface, they saw the resignation letter, and ran their checklist like it was a Tuesday in Q3. They didn't ask how I'd phrased it. They didn't search for clause triggers. They definitely didn't think to check the notarized copies in the compliance vault, each one signed annually, like clockwork. During system audits, I led myself. The CFO had been copied on the exit thread. He'd approved my departure with a 2-word email. Understood. Proceed. I bet he thought it was closed. Another legacy off the books. What he didn't know was that Clause 14E had been reinforced last year during a minor revision to the severance architecture, one he'd signed off on, bundled inside a 212-page quarterly review packet. He never noticed the paragraph labeled Revised Scope of Coverage, Legacy Resignation Events. But I remembered, because I wrote it. Every year I made sure that clause stayed current, quietly, cleanly, no fuss. It was the lifeboat I'd built for others, knowing one day someone might try to throw me overboard. Now it sat ticking beneath their boardroom table, ready to blow a $4.8 million hole straight through their budget. And the best part? They'd already signed the fuse themselves. By Friday morning, the finance team had gone from routine offboarding to emergency reconciliation. The numbers didn't match the narrative. See, when a senior employee leaves voluntarily on their own terms, there are processes for clawbacks. Vested stock, performance bonuses, even healthcare transition support all hinge on whether the departure was clean or complicated. But when that same employee resigns at the company's request, and you've got a legally binding clause defining exactly what that means, none of those levers work. Accounting flagged the problem around 9:42 a.m. I wasn't on that call, obviously, but word travels fast when a line item jumps from 6 digits to 7. My resignation had tripped a failsafe. A $4.8 million adjustment hit the ledger. Retroactive severance was auto-calculated and indexed for inflation. All my unvested equity locked as matured. Benefits? Flagged for indefinite continuation under compliance override. They hadn't terminated me for cause. That would have been their only escape hatch. But no, they'd been too polite for that. Too polished. Let's offer her a dignified exit. Make it sound like her idea. So they did. And now the math was dragging them underwater. Legal tried to stall, of course, asked for a clarification memo. Finance requested updated documentation on legacy protections. Brad even tried texting me directly. I let it sit unread. Meanwhile, I sat at a corner cafe 2 blocks from their headquarters, enjoying my usual double espresso, side of judgment, and updated my LinkedIn. Taking a pause before next chapter, grateful for the past, prepared for what's next. Nothing loud, nothing bitter, just a gentle statement of fact. By noon, my old colleagues had started liking the post. A few even messaged me privately, asking if I was okay. I didn't respond to most. But one message caught my eye. Carla from finance, a good woman, overworked and always 2 steps behind the audit curve. Her message read, "Please tell me you didn't write Clause 14E." I stared at it for a second, then just typed back. I wrote Schedule C and hit send. That was the moment it clicked for them. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was leverage. Polite, clean, and about to compound. Day 6. They'd stopped emailing me directly by then. No more checking in or hoping you're well. No more cheerful HR outreach asking for feedback on my offboarding experience. Just silence. And then, late afternoon, a voicemail. A man's voice, careful, measured, but his throat caught halfway through. "Hi, Ms. Vaughn. This is Garrett Lynch with Roston and Pierce. We're currently reviewing the terms of your resignation letter, and we'd appreciate, some clarification, specifically on the phrase, effective upon full release as defined under Schedule C. If you'd be willing to connect for a brief discussion, please let us know." Click. No threats, no posturing, just a lawyer realizing, far too late, that they'd stepped into a minefield with a blindfold on. I didn't call back. I forwarded the message to my attorney, Nadine. We'd worked together for 15 years. She once negotiated a breach settlement with a pharmaceutical firm so ruthlessly the opposing counsel accidentally CC'd his therapist on the final email. Nadine didn't do drama either. She did files. By sundown, she'd sent them one PDF. No body text, no cover letter. Just one document titled Vaughn Entitlements Package Haas Full Reference PDF inside, a notarized copy of Schedule C, annual time-stamped clause revisions, each logged through our internal audit trail. Clause 14E and the linked appendices showing clear severance triggers. Proof of advisory work across all 4 audited divisions. My updated equity ledger showing matured options. A compliance memo I wrote post-merger outlining legacy protections, co-signed by the then CFO. Email receipts showing internal review confirmations on each version. All of it neat, chronological, legally unassailable. At the end of the document, 1 page, 1 line. Please confirm. Would your client prefer to proceed to settlement or litigation? That was it. I poured myself a whiskey, sat by the window, and watched the city lights flicker on like nervous synapses. Somewhere in one of those buildings, a boardroom was going cold. Phones were ringing. Legal was scrambling to interpret a clause written by someone they thought was obsolete. I wasn't bluffing. I never had to. Because when you write the rule book, you don't raise your voice. You just wait for them to realize it's already been signed. They scheduled an emergency board session that Monday. Closed doors, no recordings, no assistants. Just executives, outside counsel, and a projected PDF file that might as well have been my ghost haunting their polished walnut table. I wasn't in that room. I didn't need to be. By then, my documents were doing all the speaking I'd never raised my voice to deliver. The story filtered back to me through a friend of a friend, someone in finance who still owed me for pulling her out of a botched audit back in 2016. She said the CFO looked like he'd aged 10 years in one slide deck. He read the compiled PDF line by line, his face shifting from confusion to disbelief to something like nausea. The last page, the one Nadine wrote with surgical clarity, was still on the screen when he asked the question out loud, as if hoping someone had an answer that didn't exist. Did anyone read this before we pushed her out? No one had. Madeline, apparently, sat perfectly still, her mouth tight, nostrils flared. She asked legal what their exposure looked like. The lead counsel didn't mince words. 4.8 million, could be more depending on how she calculates the COLA index. We're liable. Clause is enforceable. Language is clean, and he paused. She's got pre-written apology language on file from 2022. That part hit hardest. 2 years ago, I drafted a template as part of a contingency document set we were building during a labor negotiation. The idea was to have clean, non-adversarial statements ready in case of a forced transition. Mine included a final thank you, a line about extraordinary legacy service, and a formal acknowledgement of my contributions to 4 internal risk divisions. It had been buried in the HR server, untouched. Until now. They wanted to offer less, of course, float a compromise, whisper the word amicable. Nadine didn't blink. She forwarded my reply, which I'd written from the comfort of my reading chair. Subject, settlement terms. Body, as filed. That's it. No greeting, no signature, no room to negotiate because I wasn't suing, I wasn't pleading, I wasn't even angry. I was delivering. They hadn't triggered a complaint. They'd activated a contract, and I was just collecting what they'd signed off on. With interest. They waited 3 weeks before making it public. Buried the announcement on a Thursday afternoon under a headline about executive realignment and strategic legacy transitions. My name was 4th in a list of 5. No details, no gratitude, just a sanitized farewell to long-serving leadership. I read it once. Didn't flinch. The actual documents, my severance letter, the final payout memo, the signed apology statement they pulled straight from the template I'd written myself, those never saw the light of day. But they were real, fully executed, digitally countersigned, archived in a compliance vault with my name across every footnote. They paid it all. Every dollar of severance, every share vested, every bonus from the last 22 years indexed to inflation down to the quarter point. Benefits extended for 18 months. Indemnity across 4 business units. Airtight and irrevocable. They even used the language I drafted, called my work instrumental in cross-divisional integration, and my departure a transition of mutual respect. It read like closure. It felt like precision. And me? I didn't post anything. I didn't comment on the announcement. Didn't take a victory lap. I changed my LinkedIn header to a quote I liked from earlier in my career. Don't fight the storm. Write the manual. I took my time. Slept in. Learned how to make perfect French bread. Taught my niece how to file her first tax return. Read contracts the way some people read poetry. Slow, deliberate, line by line. I saw Madeline once more from across a downtown crosswalk. She didn't notice me, too busy yelling into a phone, probably trying to resuscitate another renewal strategy. I didn't wave. I just kept walking. Because the truth is, this was never about revenge. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. They chose the door. I just made sure it was one they'd never fully understand, because they never stopped to ask who'd built the frame.